Pleased to introduce you to our first plenary speaker, Dr. Brice Semmens. Dr. Semmens is a professor here at Scripps. He's also the director of the California Cooperative Oceanic Fisheries Investigations, or CalCOFI. Professor Semmens is a quantitative fisheries scientist and a statistical ecologist. His impressive body of work has shaped the conservation of fishery populations worldwide. He'll be introducing you to the framework of assessing life in the dynamic ocean. So please welcome Dr. Semmens.
Okay, hi everybody. Can we dim the lights a little bit, or is that not possible? No response. That's cool. So I just came from another meeting, and at that meeting, for their snack, we had individually wrapped in plastic brownie bites, and it made me realize that even in the hallowed halls of our scientific institutions, sometimes meetings and people can be a little bit tone deaf. As Anela pointed out, I am a fisheries scientist, and I don't have a lot of expertise, or at least I didn't up until a couple of days ago, expertise in the world of plastics, but actually that was really great. It was really great for me because I got to take a deep dive into the current literature on the subject and start to formulate a talk that really describes the scope and scale of the problem of plastics in the ocean. And what I think is really neat is that while I am not necessarily an expert in this topic, we have a bunch of experts in the room and are participating in this workshop. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited to interact with these folks, many of whom I'm going to be citing throughout the course of this talk. And also they get to correct me when I say things that are incorrect. So with that in mind, we'll start by talking about, in terms of scope and scale, production of plastics. So it really wasn't until the early 1950s that plastics became a commercial product. And within short order, the ramp up in terms of production of plastics was really on an exponential trajectory. And so this is a graph that goes through the late 2000s to the 2010s, really right at the point at which the economic downturn happened. And so except for basically a monotonic increase in production, you see that really little tick at the very end, and that was during the Great Recession that happened recently. And if we actually carry that out into more recent times, that upward swing continues its inexorable trajectory. So in recent times, we're at about 300 million tons of plastic production per year globally. A lot of that has to do with packaging. Roughly 40% of all the plastics that we produce is packaging, whether or not that's individually wrapped brownie bites or it's water bottles that we're drinking and getting served at our meetings here. So lots and lots of plastic. Of that, roughly 300 million tons per year, 4 to 12 million tons of that enters our ocean every year. So 1.5 to 4.5% of global production somehow or other ends its way up into the ocean. And that number or amount of plastic that's ending up in the ocean is expected to double in the next decade. So there's no slowdown in plastic production, and there's no slowdown in terms of that plastic entering the ocean in terms of an increasing trajectory. What's really interesting, though, is we don't know where 99% of that plastic goes once it goes into the ocean. We have some indication of where plastics is, and we're going to be talking a lot throughout this workshop, and I'll be talking a lot today about large plastic and microplastics and maybe even nanoplastics. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the plastic that hits the ocean, we don't know where it ends up yet, and so that's a big part of ongoing research, is to try and figure out what the fate is of plastic that enters the ocean. But in the end, you see something like this, right? So we think about global problems and we zoom in on the actual inputs of plastics to the ocean, and it might look something like this. So here's a river output from Haiti in the Caribbean, and there's a huge exodus of plastic, particularly after large rains. And so what happens to this plastic once it ultimately hits the ocean? What is the fate of that plastic? And what can we say about that input of plastic into the ocean? And we have a general sense of this, which is that at some point the plastics come out into the river or the nearshore coastal environment, and they get broken up both by solar irradiation as well as mechanical mixing in the nearshore waters. Some of that plastic, especially the heavier plastics like PVC, immediately sinks and goes to the bottom, but the remainder floats and continues to break up as it moves out into the open ocean. There's interactions with animals along the way. at times in terms of both eating the plastics and also creating habitats for the animals as well. At some point, that plastic that's still floating is in the gyre and continues to break up. Some portion of that might sink and hit the sediment, and at that point, that plastic could become part of the food chain in the sediment, or might actually be put back up into the water column through bioturbation. So that's kind of the general, as we understand it, the general process of plastics, but we tend to think about plastics in terms of the great garbage patch, right? We think about this area, as they always say, the size of Texas, which I think in a lot of people's minds is something that you could literally just get off a boat and walk across, right? And it's not like that, but it certainly is a larger concentration of plastic in these certain areas. And these areas that happen around the globe, they're driven by oceanic processes. So we have areas of persistent high pressure at certain parts along our oceans, and those areas of high pressure cause winds or air to move up and down depending on whether or not you're on the north side of that area of persistent high pressure. And through Coriolis forces, that creates trade winds. Right? Trade winds, winds that move either east or west in a persistent manner. And those winds in turn drive surface currents. And in areas where you have these centroids of high pressure zones that are persistent, you get these gyres or surface-driven currents that end up basically in large eddies, and those things over time accrue more and more plastic. They're centers of aggregation of plastics. And so there's really 5 major gyres that exist out there. And one of those is off our west coast here in California, and that's where that great northern Pacific garbage patch exists. And so these are the 5 gyres, and each one of those is associated with larger concentrations of plastics in the ocean, and we can actually model this, right? So we can take what we know about the oceanography and wind-driven surface currents, and we can place particles in a virtual world, and we can simulate them forward for 10 years and see where they end up, and predictably, we would say, based on modeling exercises, that the vast majority of the plastic particles we simulate end up in these gyres, or in these large eddies, including right here, and of course that's our giant Pacific garbage patch that you can't walk across, but it's still, there's a lot of plastic there, right? Okay, and in fact, if we overlay recent oceanic expeditions to go out and actually sample with nets, either bongo nets or manta toes, the same types of nets we might use to collect zooplankton and ichthyoplankton, we can use those same nets to sample plastics, and it turns out that, yes, in these major areas of aggregation of coastal or surface wind-driven conditions, you get also larger concentrations of plastics. All right. In our neck of the woods, we have CalCoffee, which is the California Cooperative Oceanic Fisheries Investigations, and it is a coastal observing ship-based program that's been happening since 1947. And CalCoffee is unique in that both its scope is larger than any ocean observing program that's continuous for 70 years, but it also is a physical sample-based program. So they actually take out with ships nets, and they go and collect zooplankton, ichthyoplankton, along with other environmental data, physical data like pH and oxygen, carbonate system. And this is great because it tells us something about the distribution and abundance of nearshore animals, and it's not really nearshore. They're going out 500 kilometers or more in these stations. But the other thing too is because we have preserved samples of what these nets collected way back to 1947, we have the makings of a sample of microplastics for the last 70 years across our entire West Coast and more contemporary contexts across most of California. Okay, and so some preliminary analysis have been done using that data, and it turns out that if you look at samples from 1984, 1994, and 2007, the two things are apparent, I think, are interesting. The majority of our CalCoffee stations, or those locations using the ship where we stop and sample, have plastics. What's really interesting, though, is if you go back 30 years into the 1980s, they still had plastics, and there is no significant difference in the amount of stations that had plastics compared to those 3 different regions of time. So plastics, even though we really only started having major production of plastics in the 50s, already by 84, you had microplastics in most of the samples. And this is the scratching the surface, right? What's really interesting to me, and we haven't done it yet, is to go back and look at the spatial distribution and abundance of samples in the Cal Coffee data across the entire time set. And if we do that, we actually have arguably the single largest, most comprehensive sampling of plastics anywhere in the entire world, right here. All we've got to do is do the hard work of processing the samples. Okay, and this is just to point out that that's when Cal Coffee started, right? So we literally encompass the entire time that plastics were created. So it's a unique data set. Other examples of sampling that I've taken, this is an oceanographic survey that went out specifically to go survey the garbage patch and used a series of different sampling techniques. The key takeaway here is that these are the estimates of the particle concentrations of different sampling stations that they hit, and the M's here stand for manitoes and the B's stand for bongo nets. Those are just different sampling types. What I want you to notice is the y-axis is on the log scale. There are massive differences in the number of concentrations or the concentration of plastics in the different samples. So variability in the plastics in the ocean is huge, huge, and that's a real challenge for us. Because if we want to say something about the change in the relative abundance of microplastics through time, gosh, we're going to have to do a lot of sampling in a very strategic way in order to have the resolution, in order to monitor and measure what that change looks like through time. What's really interesting too about this particular study is that they demonstrated quite convincingly that there wasn't a very direct correlation between the amount of microplastics underneath the surface and the amount of macroplastics at the surface. So those pieces of plastics that were large enough for people to see with binoculars from a ship. So the correlation between those two things is low and the variability in microplastics is high. What that really means is one of the things we need to be very concerned with is how we survey the world if we hope to be able to characterize the change in plastic through time. Nonetheless, there are surveys that have demonstrated really convincingly that there have been major changes in the amount of microplastics through time. So this study looked at, in the 1970s, of the two graphs estimating the density of microplastics, and then again in the 2010s on the right, those two. And what you'll see is that there's a 2 order of magnitude difference in the density of microplastics between those 2 decades. The difference between this study and the Cal Coffee study, this survey was done inside those centers of aggregation, inside the place where plastics accrue. Right? In Cal Coffee, we're in the transition zone. We're in the place where plastics move away from. They ultimately aggregate in those gyres, not along our California coast. And so these are the sorts of things in a global context we need to consider if we're hoping to monitor changes in the density of plastic through time. Whereas Cal Coffee might provide a rate, something like monitoring the gyre might tell you a total abundance or a density. If we think about plastics in the context of ecosystem impacts, biological impacts, we tend to have conversations about how microplastics might accrue. We know that microplastics end up in lots and lots of different organisms' stomachs, and it stands to reason that if one organism eats another organism and something else eats that, in terms of a trophic food chain, that you would expect some version of biomagnification of plastics in the stomachs of those animals that are eating other animals that have eaten plastic. Turns out, though, that there's not a great deal of evidence to suggest that that is actually true, or at least it hasn't been well demonstrated yet. So we think also of maybe impacts associated with chemicals associated with microplastics impacting the health of the organisms that we eat, or in turn impacting our health as humans that rely on seafood to a greater or lesser extent. Again, there is not a huge amount of evidence that that actually takes place. So if you think about the chemicals that are actually used to make plastics, and we've all heard about BPA, right? So BPA is it's probably the single greatest globally regulated chemical. It's a synthetic estrogen, also is nonylphenol, NP. Both those chemicals that are commonly used in plastics production are synthetic estrogens. They're known to at high concentrations, cause birth defects, and they have lots of nasty things happening when you have a lot of them in your system. So the question is whether or not when we eat plastics that have those things, or when something eats plastic that has those things, do those nasty chemicals transfer into the bloodstream, into the biological system? And so people have tried this in several different instances where they've actually gone ahead and fed plastic to things and measured the concentrations of these things in the biological system, whether or not they're feeding lobsters or fish. And guess what? There's really not a lot of evidence to suggest that that transfer happens in any real sense. Very, very small, very small. The other thing that might be happening is that POPs, or persistent organic pollutants. These plastic pieces, when they're floating around, especially as they get smaller, they become essentially little sponges where they pick up organic pollutants that are in the environment existing. So you get plastic pollutants, or these little plastic pellets, and they serve as aggregating devices for things like PCBs. And of course, PCBs are not good, right? Lots of reasons why we don't want to consume PCBs. And so you can take those plastic pellets that are loaded with PCBs and you can feed them to things like lobsters, and then you can look at the extent to which PCBs transfer into lobster flesh. Turns out it really doesn't. It really doesn't. So there is a lot of concern about the chemical impacts of plastics. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm saying we haven't found it yet, or at least not clearly. And again, other people that are a lot more intelligent than I can correct me on this, but my dive into the literature over the last couple days seems to suggest to me that there's not a lot of evidence that the chemical impacts associated with ingestion of plastic are huge. And the other thing that, of course, I'll point out is there's very little evidence or research that's been done to look at the exposure of microplastics in the marine environment relative to other parts of our world, whether or not we're dealing with makeup or hairspray or any of the other things that have plastics associated with it. And in fact, there's a huge line of medical research right now looking at nanoplastics as vehicles for delivery of drugs. Actually giving you as a medicine nanoplastics that are loaded with drugs, because we know predictably how they move from the gut system into the bloodstream and then accrue in certain parts of your body. So there's the other side of the medical world that's actually looking at the possibility of using nanoplastics as vehicles for delivering drugs to us. All right, so what we do know is that microplastics have lots of other really bad things. They result in lots of bad things, at least what we consider to be bad things. One of those is of course, stowaways. So they essentially create forms of habitat that allow organisms from big to small in order to attach and raft and get themselves to places where they don't currently exist. So we've talked about these gyres, and here's a paper that looked at the impact of bringing invasive species from debris that came from the tsunami that hit Japan. And we talked about gyres as accruing those pieces of plastic and floating flotsam, but of course they don't all go into those gyres, and some of those things break off those gyres from time to time, and they end up over here on the west coast. And so we see large rafted pieces of plastic, or docks, for instance, that showed up on Oregon coast and brought up a diversity of different demersal species, sessile species, but also even fishes. They found knife jaws, which is a kind of fish that you don't find on this coast, but you'll find it over in the Asian Pacific. So as we get more and more of these things in the environment floating around, it provides more and more habitat that allows transport of things to different ecosystems and habitats that they weren't naturally existing within. And of course, probably the most visual impacts from the plastics that we see is through ingestion and entanglement. So there's been tons of work done on ingestion, and of course you've probably all seen these pictures, right? Which are just disturbing to say the least. Many different seabirds are impacted by ingestion of plastic. This is from a study by Wilcox fairly recently in Proceedings of National Academy, showing that there's been an increase through time in the proportion, for particular studies, in the proportion of birds that had plastic in their guts. And again, through time, the number and amount of plastic ingestion in individual birds within studies. And then finally, if you look at the accumulation of known species of seabirds that have interactions in terms of ingestion of plastic, this is that curve right now. So if you look at this graph right here, this is the amount of species affected by ocean plastics as a function of space along the map. And what you'll notice is that map does not look like the distribution of plastics in the ocean. Right? You don't see the gyre. What you see is that is the global richness of birds. In other words, if you are an ocean bird, you're impacted by plastic, no matter where you are. And because of that, the number of birds impacted by plastic as a function of space is simply a function of the diversity of birds in that region. So it's absolutely pervasive. In terms of entanglement and ingestion, so Wilcox also did a study, this was published in Marine Policy, where they solicited expert advice by people that do plastics for a living, and they asked them to kind of rank relative risks of plastic in the marine environment to the biology of the marine environment. And the thing that really cropped up as the most important is ingestion and entanglement, poses threats to marine fauna, fishing gear and balloons in terms of entanglements and threats, and then plastic bags and utensils in terms of ingestion. So the direct impacts of interactions of large organisms and small organisms and the plastics themselves is really probably one of the biggest impacts of oceanic plastic. Okay, and then I'll end with this, which is that we as scientists, we tend to go out and study the world and think about, okay, what's the impact on our trophic ecology? What's the impact on our ecosystem? Let's get into the weeds and look at the chemical impacts on our biological processes within our body. But the reality is that in most of our society, this is what people are most concerned with. This is the impact to them. This is their economic impact, which is they're hoping to have a pristine, clean experience on the ocean, and they don't. They can't. Oftentimes because it's hard to find a place in this world that doesn't have plastic impacts associated with it. And Lord help you if you find yourself on a windward side of an island in the Caribbean, because it's just going to be coated with flip-flops, my friends, all over the place. And so this is a real impact. It may not be biological, it may not be ecological, but it's a societal impact and something that needs to be addressed just as much as those other impacts. All right, thank you very much.